You know what they say about big feet? Big scares. At least that's been my experience. Bigfoot or Sasquatch is a well-known North American monster for a very good reason. It has been witnessed thousands of times and is continuously seen to this day. But many people don't believe. I can understand that. Some people just can't believe in something so bizarre, until that something is throwing rocks larger than your head at you with ease on the hiking trails, in between strange grumbling and whistling sounds. So, be careful. These are allegedly real sightings and encounters with Bigfoot creatures. If you want your story to appear in a future video, share it with us at darknessprevails.org. Now, let's get back into the woods. The Silhouette in the Shadows. From Jay. Location: Grand Mesa National Forest in Colorado. Several years ago, my dad was in town on a break from work. My brothers, my dad, and myself decided to go on a fishing trip up to one of our favorite mountains in the Grand Mesa National Forest. On the way up, my brothers had made a joke about Bigfoot. Now you can obviously see where this tale is going. It wasn't uncommon for us to bring up the subject of Bigfoot. We always talked about it when we were younger, fascinated by the topic. Upon the subject being broached, my brother had said something along the lines of, "Like your encounter, Dad?" I was confused and instantly asked what they were talking about. The town we live in is the very same one that my dad, Wayne, grew up in. Back when Wayne was in his late teens, he and his friends decided to go late-night catfishing right off the Colorado River. They fished right off the bank and had a nice fire going, drinking beer and talking about girls and who knows what else. About an hour into their late-night fishing trip, they heard a very loud splash in the water. Right away, one of the first things they had thought was that it must have been a beaver slapping its tail in the water. Not long after, another loud splash, but closer. "That one sounded like a rock," one of them stated. My dad and his friends began to walk closer to the edge of the water. They scanned parts of the bank that weren't completely hidden in foliage. My dad, in particular, looked in the river itself and the bank on the opposing side. In the middle of the night, the moonlight cast a bit of light, but not much. Yet it was light enough that Dad could see movement directly across from them on the other side of the river. It was a tall, dark shadow. At that instant, a large rock landed just short of my dad's feet, splashing him and his friend Chuck. Instantly, Dad knew that it came from the other side of the river. For this spot on the Colorado River, it was well over 400 feet wide. I don't know how many of you have tried to throw a golf ball-sized rock that distance, but it's not easy. But this was more like a river rock, being around 10 inches in diameter. No human could do that. As Dad and his friends were staring across, unable to detect the source of the rock thrower, another stone was hurled directly at them. The group scatters as it hit the soil hard in between the four of them. One of them grabbed the cobblestone. They had to use both hands to do so and could barely stand up with it. Slowly, they all went back to the fire. There was a moment of silence as none of them knew how to react. Finally, the friend named Lopez spoke. "Who on earth can throw a rock that big across a river like that?" It was the obvious question that they were all thinking. A few eerie moments passed, and it seemed to stop. With no more rocks being thrown, they all loosened up a bit, enjoying some more beer and almost getting to the point of laughing the incident off, when suddenly, John screamed, "Wayne, duck!" My dad dodged to the side as yet another large stone came all the way across the river and landed in their fire pit. That was enough. They were in danger. Dad and his friends withdrew their fishing poles, jumped in the truck, and left. They had talked a few times trying to figure out what this was, the verdict being that some kids must have come up with a sort of catapult and they were just too well hidden for them to see, though Dad never really believed that explanation. At the end of that summer, a friend of my dad's that we'll call Tim called my dad to see if he wanted to catfish by boat that night. Tim had gotten a new aluminum boat that he kept wanting to fish out of. Reluctantly, my dad accepted this time, as he had been turning him down all summer. It wasn't because of the previous events that took place. Those were pretty much in the back of my dad's mind. No, Tim, even though a friend, got on my dad's nerves. It had been a full moon that night, so they decided to hit the river with the boat. Most of the night was pretty uneventful, catching a few fish here and there, having a few laughs, and obviously having some beer. It was the last leg of their journey when out of nowhere, something hit the boat. It was a very loud ping that shook both of them awake out of their half-dazed states. "What the?" was all Tim could get out, before there was a loud splash in front of the boat. They both looked around, and it was then that my dad spotted it. On the south side of the river stood a large silhouette. The river's pace had them just drifting along, but the moon and sky were so clear that night, my dad could see the figure. It was huge. Whoever he was, or whatever it was absolutely massive. The big silhouette bent over, grabbed another rock, and hurled it easily, striking the boat once again. Enough had been enough. My dad, not sure what to think, reached down and grabbed his revolver. He knelt down on one knee, aiming at the figure. It didn't seem to care or understand, instead walking at the same pace to keep up with the boat. When it bent down again, presumably to grab another rock, my dad fired into the air. The figure rose suddenly in the same awkward throwing motion. It hurled another rock going over the boat this time, splashing them. My dad was fed up and fired again, this time in front of the figure, not trying to hit it, but trying to scare it. However, it didn't work, as the figure stayed side by side with them. Tim, being more cowardly, was freaking out. My dad was scared as well, but curious too. Who the heck was this that was attacking them? Why were they so big? Why were they following their boat? He would not get his answer though, as the river picked up speed, and doing so the silhouette sped up its walk, but not enough to keep up with them. The creature finally stopped, then just stared at them as they drifted away. You might be thinking, well, your dad just told you a Bigfoot story. Well, there's a problem with that. Knowing my dad, he's a very down-to-earth person. If me and my brothers tell a story of how big a fish we caught was, my dad is skeptical. The point being, he under-embellishes everything. Even when he told me these stories, he shrugged them off like they were no big deal. Not to mention my dad never even made the correlation of it being a Bigfoot until about 30 years later when his friend was watching a documentary about Bigfoot. Apparently, one of its preferred habits is rock throwing, but still, my dad is quite skeptical. The Night That Changed My Life, from Yeti San. Location, Tennessee. This is the experience that had me believing in the paranormal, supernatural, and cryptids in particular. Being a country boy from Tennessee, growing up meant camping trips and four-wheeling with my dad. One particular trip, when I was probably 9 or 10, we had gone on a 4-day trip in the Blue Ridge Mountain area on some property that one of his friends owned. I remember it was heavily forested, nearly untouched, except for a small plot of land where he had built a log cabin. We met up at his cabin and set out on four-wheelers to an area with a small stream that ran through a small flat area. We decided to set up our tents next to it and start a fire. We had brought enough supplies, such as hot dogs, marshmallows, and s'mores. The plan was to fish though. For me, it wasn't about the food, it was just catch and release fun. After having eaten and talked around the fire for a while, we decided to go to bed since we had a big day of four-wheeling and fishing the next day. My dad and I shared a large tent with mesh openings, to let in airflow and moonlight. After I had fallen asleep around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of someone or something moving around our campsite. I could see the light outside getting blocked from entering our tent every so often, meaning that something was walking in front of it. I quietly woke up my dad and explained the situation. He grabbed his .45 and unzipped the flap, but didn't see anything, so he told me to quit worrying and to go back to sleep. Seeing that my dad wasn't worried put me at ease, and eventually I did go back to sleep. Upon waking up in the morning, we noticed that there were what looked like bare footprints around our campsite. At this point in my life, I had heard of Bigfoot, so you better believe I brought it up as an explanation to my dad. But he laughed at me and said, "Don't you think the footprints would be bigger?" Given that they were only slightly bigger than my dad's, who wears a size 13, which I don't know what translates to actual foot size, we all naturally assumed that it was some person walking around, not a wild animal. Naturally, though, this was enough to unnerve us, but we did have protection with us, so we decided to go on with the trip. We ate some breakfast, did a little fishing before we decided to go riding the trails on the four-wheelers. We got back right around dusk and built a fire to once again eat dinner. This time, my dad's friend stayed up a little longer just to see if anyone would come around again. My dad and I once again retired to our tent to sleep, and this is where things pick back up. It seems like I had no sooner closed my eyes when I was suddenly startled awake by my dad and his friend telling me to get up, that we had to go. Naturally, I'm curious as to what's going on. The urgency was scaring me. That's when I heard something huge hit the water nearby. It was still dark, and the fire was fading down now, so I couldn't see what it was, but I know it was too big for any person to throw. Now I was freaking out really bad. Both the adults had their arms drawn, and something was throwing things that sounded like boulders at us. My dad and his friend jumped on their four-wheelers and shouted at me to get on. A 4-day trip is being cut short by something I haven't seen and is terrifying two grown men with police training, men that are used to being outdoors. As we begin speeding down the trail towards his cabin, I remember turning around to look towards all our supplies that we'd left behind, to see the faint outlines of two extremely tall figures. They were standing just outside the fading light of our fire by the tree line. It was so long ago, I couldn't give an accurate estimate of the size, but all I can say is that one of them was massive, nearly half the height of one of those trees, way too big to be a person, and the other was a bit smaller. We made it back to the cabin in about 20 minutes or so, and sat out on the porch until the adrenaline stopped. Finally, when everything calmed down, I asked what had just happened, why my dad's friend freaked out so much in the first place. He said, "I was sitting next to the fire when I heard twigs breaking, so I prepared for a confrontation. Then I heard a loud, deep guttural noise followed by what sounded like someone snapping a huge branch, or even a sapling right in half." He then looked at my dad and said, "When I looked in the direction of the noises, I saw the reflection of what looked like two large blue eyes reflecting the light of the fire towards me from the darkness. That's when I realized we were not dealing with people." We sat around for a little while, contemplating whether to stay at the cabin or make the journey home half asleep, but the choice would soon be made for us. Suddenly, a loud haunting call or howl, whatever you want to call it, came from somewhere back in the woods. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and it still sends chills down my spine 20 years later. We dashed to our vehicles and sped home in record time. The following morning, my dad called his friend who told him that he'd taken a group of people back to the site to help retrieve the supplies. But when he got there, it was pretty much destroyed, and there were massive footprints all over the place. My dad had pretty much accepted the Bigfoot hypothesis at this point, but if that weren't enough, somewhat later on, maybe a few months or a year, we were watching TV together when we happened upon a show where some people were hunting for Bigfoot in Texas. They were doing a technique called blasting, where supposed Sasquatch howls are played loudly into the wilderness in hopes of a response. As soon as they played those howls, my dad and I looked at each other, and I got that same chill and that same surge of adrenaline that I did so long ago. At that moment, it was undeniable that what we had experienced must have been Bigfoot. Sasquatch, or whatever it was. From Nick. Location: unknown. I'm going to say that this quick story was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me and to my friend. I was 12 and he was 10 at the time when it happened. We were on our normal spring turkey hunt with his family. We went out that morning with no luck, didn't see a thing. The birds weren't even chirping, didn't even see any squirrels rustling about, just nothing. So we went back to camp and decided he and I would go down to the creek to fish for a while. We were down there for about 2 hours, then eventually decided to pack back up and head back to camp. We were walking along the trail when I got this odd feeling to look back. I saw this massive dark thing or person standing there, looking at us. When both of us had seen it, we froze, terrified. When the creature took a step towards us, we basically raced back to camp. We told his mom and dad what we saw, and they walked back there with us to the very same spot where we saw it. There was nothing there, save for the unnaturally large, human-like footprints. Bigfoot. From CT. Location: unknown. My brother and I were staying the night at our grandparents' house. We would often go there a lot. We're from the south, and where we lived it was a small town. To get to our grandparents' house, you would have to drive very far, and they lived down a dirt road. You wouldn't see any other houses for miles. It was mostly just extremely tall trees. You could say that our grandparents lived in the boondocks. At the time, my brother and I were 6 and 7, respectively. I remember we pulled up to the house and all the dogs were outside barking and running alongside the car. It was a funny thing for us. My brother and I absolutely loved visiting, but our mother not too much. I also always thought their house was weird. It was a few feet off the ground and on stilts in places. We got out of the car and made our way to the front door. The stairs are wooden and not too tightly nailed on there, so they would wobble and sway a bit when you walked up there. We knocked on the door and were greeted by a very happy grandma. We went into the kitchen and visited for a while. Eventually, my mom left. We packed our stuff away. Then we played games in the living room until dinner time. Eventually, it was time to go to bed. Now, we slept in our grandparents' room. They were much older and never slept in the same room, so I would sleep in my grandma's room and he would sleep in my grandpa's room. When it came time for bed, we would wash up for bed and say goodnight. Now, my brother and my grandpa's room was closer to the woods. I remember looking out the window from that room, and it was so scary. But that night, my brother saw something. He said he couldn't sleep very well, and that he was staring out the window. That's when he saw something very tall and covered in hair. It walked past the window a bit, stopped, and then stared back at my brother. My brother was terrified. He actually got out of bed, came over to me and woke me up, telling me that I just had to see this. And when I did, I was horrified too. The silhouette began to walk, and it passed by the window entirely. We were both so creeped out at that point that I power walked back into the room I was sleeping in and hid myself under the covers. The following day, we both tried to tell our grandparents what we saw, but they were too focused on being upset that we didn't sleep good last night. We had a rule that we were supposed to stay in bed at bedtime. Mom came over that day as well, but just after knocking on the door and being let inside, she said that she saw someone extremely tall passing by the back of the house. Mine and my brother's story had been confirmed, and there was no way that some person was standing that tall. But no matter what we did, my grandparents wouldn't believe us. but the dogs definitely did, considering how crazy they went that night and the day after. I Saw Bigfoot Twice, from John N. Location, Ohio. I was staying at a friend's house in southern Ohio, and it made up part of 1,000 private acres altogether. He had been experiencing some strange activity going on, like screaming that sounded human-like from deep in the woods. I told him with a laugh that it was probably Bigfoot. One night I couldn't sleep. It was about 4 a.m. I went out on the porch to get some fresh air, and that's when I heard a loud grunt coming from the woods nearby, followed by the sound of something panicking, screaming for its life, like whatever was making the grunting sound was hurting it. I ran inside, my terror making it even harder to sleep. Soon daylight rolls around. I get brave enough to go where I heard the sounds last night. I walk out the door, then down the porch, then down the hill. I'm standing at the edge of the woods when this thing springs up on 2 feet. I was not expecting anything to be there, but there it was. I could see it through the brush, whatever it was. It didn't belong here. It was so unnatural, and what happened next scared the crap out of me. The thing hissed at me twice, then took off running. I followed suit, running back toward the house, hyperventilating for the first time in my life. I mean, what if that thing wanted to attack me? It had to have been 8 feet tall, over 500 pounds. I managed to make it back inside the house, and it took me a few hours to finally calm down. I woke my friend up and told him what I'd seen. He said it was probably just a deer. No, I'm not crazy enough to think that that was a deer. At the very least, deer don't walk on 2 legs. Frustrated, my friend didn't believe me. I went into the woods looking for prints, but the only thing I found was where something large had been lying. Did I wake Bigfoot up? Had I stumbled upon him sleeping? I went into the woods a little farther. I was bent over examining the ground when over my left shoulder I heard the hissing again. I thought it was my friend trying to surprise and scare me, so I slowly rise. When I look in that direction, I saw the creature again. It was running away like before. My mouth dropped, and I think I cursed. Its head was cone-shaped, and its arms were way too long, but it was quite fast. Again, I took off running, but this time I did not leave the house for the rest of the day, and after that visit, I didn't go back to my friend's place for a while. The Unknown, from ScrioSadh. Location, unknown. It was a warmer than usual winter day in 2007. My 2 friends and I were riding our bikes just outside of town. We were troublesome, always going where we shouldn't. We were right by the National Guard artillery garrison in our town. Across the street was an abandoned house, seemingly recently abandoned. We decided one day to go check it out. Once inside the house, we were met with a strange sight. Everything had been taken out of the house, save many empty and old adult film cases, drawings, and phone books. A little weirded out, I decided to look around out back. There was a small silver bullet camper, stuffed full of appliances and furniture, like they planned to return it back into the house one day. I was getting bored now with my friends obsessing over the drawings and pictures. I decided to take a walk through the nearby woods. After 2 or so minutes of walking, my head starts to vibrate, and I feel kind of fuzzy, if that makes sense. I turned around and I could no longer see the house. For some reason, I didn't feel threatened by it or in danger, so I just kept walking. After a couple more minutes, I come across a brand new looking barn. Befuddled, I walk inside. I'm met with the visage of a creature reminiscent of Bigfoot, but it was different. It was large, 8 feet or so, with no hair. Its skin was light gray and saggy. I didn't see a discernible mouth, ears, or nose. and it had 2 tiny black dots for eyes. When I walked into that barn, it was knelt over a prone horse, yet there was no red. I don't know what it was doing to the horse, but as soon as I saw it, it stood up, bulked up, turned around to face me, and started to walk towards me. Not waiting another second, I turned tail and ran back to my friends, who I proceeded to tell what I had just seen. They laughed at me and rushed to the back door to look. It was emerging from the woods then, still just walking. It didn't make a sound as it walked, even though we watched it making footfall. We ran to our bikes and rode home in a matter of minutes. Years passed by and I decided to Google Earth the location to see how far the woods went beyond the house, as I was thinking of going back there to see if I could find it again. However, I discovered something strange. The woods only go back 20 yards, and there was no sign of any barn or building. Tall furry animal. From Brody B. Location unknown. I was about 13 at the time. It was a warm night and me and some of my friends were sleeping over. At a certain point during the night, we decided to play hide and seek or manhunt. I was it first, as I always am, for whatever reason. I started counting, then soon was off to search. A few minutes into my manhunt, I was hearing footsteps, but they were heavier than my friends. We were all teenagers, and whatever this was much bigger and heavier. I began to slowly walk over to the sound of the footsteps, and I was not prepared to see what I saw. There was this tall, hairy creature. It was wandering between the trees, slowly walking through the forest. I couldn't help but let out the most chilling scream. The creature, of course, heard this and turned around, beginning to growl at me. When its growl echoed through the woods, all my friends got up from their spots. Many of them saw the thing, and they all began running. My adrenaline was pumping. We ran back toward the house together. I grabbed the garden shovel. At least it would be something to protect myself with. My friends and I ran inside. We hid in my room, me still clutching the shovel. We heard footsteps outside for a while, before eventually we were relieved, hearing the footsteps fade away into the forest. It was 3 months ago as of writing this, and we haven't had an encounter or sighting of it since. I've never really liked feet. They gross me out. There was only one time in my life where you'd catch me wearing open-toed footwear, and that was before I picked out my own clothes. But never did I think that feet were something to fear. Now, with Bigfoot stalking the forests, whistling, tossing boulders, and often surprising hikers and campers, you don't know what it's capable of, and you don't want to find out. Fear those big feet. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget, you can send in your stories for a chance to have them narrated at darknessprevails.org. If you want to support the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/darknessprevails or by shopping our merchandise at teespring.com/stores/darknessprevails. Or if you're watching on YouTube, just click the shop button below. Thank you. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous video about 5 true paranormal horror stories. Jackson Rowley says, "Let's get this bread." I don't know what you mean by this, but I'm definitely starving right now and I would love any sort of bread in my mouth. Yum yum. Banana Mukbang says, "The only horror story I got is me in the washroom after the Taco Bell." Ew. I wasn't prepared for something that disturbing. Ulysses Peralta says, "I just ate a salad." Man, what's with all these food comments? Did you guys know I was going to read these while I was hungry? Freaking psychic. Kylie Brenton says, "Love your videos. Always listen to them whilst doing some art. Hey, I'd love to see a link to some of your work if you've got it." I'm Under Your Bed says, "When all else fails, darkness prevails." That's freaking right. Should probably be my next t-shirt design. Well then, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned, and leave your ideas for what you want to hear in the comments. Until next time, here are the credits to my patrons who continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.